The wedding dress felt like a cage of silk and lace as Margaret Harrison stood at the altar of Philadelphia's most prestigious church, staring at Charles Worthington III, the man who had never once asked what made her heart sing. The organ swelled with Wagner's bridal chorus, but all Margaret could hear was the hollow echo of her own voice saying, "I do," to a life that would slowly suffocate her spirit. "Do you, Margaret Elizabeth Harrison, take this man?" She didn't let the Reverend finish. In front of 300 guests, Philadelphia's elite, her mother's tears, and Charles's bewildered face, Margaret gathered her voluminous skirts and ran. Her satin slippers slapped against the marble floor as gasps rippled through the congregation like a stone thrown into still water. "Margaret!" Charles's voice carried none of the passion she'd always craved, only the irritation of a man whose carefully planned schedule had been disrupted. She burst through the church doors into the bright June morning of 1867, her veil streaming behind her like a white flag of surrender, or perhaps, of freedom. She had no plan, no destination, only the bone-deep certainty that she would rather face complete uncertainty than the predictable prison of a loveless marriage. Margaret had tried to explain it to her mother the night before. "He never asks about my dreams, Mama. He talks about his railroad investments and his political ambitions, but when I mention the poems I've been writing, his eyes glaze over as if I've started speaking Chinese." Her mother had patted her hand dismissively. "Dreams are for children, dear. Charles will provide you with security, position, everything a woman could want. Everything except being seen. Everything except being wanted for something more than her family's name and her ability to host dinner parties." The streets of Philadelphia blurred past as Margaret ran, her breath coming in gasps, her corset stays digging into her ribs. She had some money, her grandmother's secret inheritance, tucked away in a small purse she'd hidden in the folds of her dress. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy passage west, to disappear into the vast American frontier where no one knew the name Harrison, where she could become someone new. By sunset, Margaret was on a train heading toward St. Louis, then on to the frontier territories. She traded her wedding dress for a simple calico traveling outfit from a bemused seamstress in a small Missouri town. With each mile that passed, she felt lighter, as if she were shedding not just the dress but every expectation that had been draped over her like heavy winter coats. 3 weeks later, her stagecoach broke an axle in the middle of Comanche territory in Texas. The driver, a grizzled man named Hobbs, surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "We're 2 days from Fort Griffin, ma'am. Best we can do is camp here and pray the Comanches are feeling neighborly." They weren't alone in their misfortune. Another passenger, a missionary named Reverend Carstairs, began praying loudly for divine intervention. An elderly woman clutched her carpetbag and wept. But Margaret felt strangely calm, as if running from her wedding had used up all her capacity for fear. As twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, they came. 3 Comanche warriors materialized from the landscape as if formed from the earth itself. They sat astride their horses with a natural grace that made Charles's careful posture on his prize stallion look like a child playing at horsemanship. The lead warrior wore his long black hair adorned with feathers, and his eyes held an intelligence that seemed to take in everything at once. Hobbs raised his rifle, but Margaret, surprising herself, stepped forward. "Please," she said quietly. "We mean no harm. Our wheel is broken." The lead warrior's gaze fixed on her, and she felt truly seen for the first time in her life, not as a Harrison of Philadelphia, not as Charles's intended bride, but as herself. He dismounted in one fluid motion and approached, stopping a respectful distance away. "You speak," he said in careful English, "but your eyes speak more. They say you are lost." "Yes," Margaret answered honestly. "But I'm trying to become found." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. He spoke to his companions in their own language, then turned back to her. "I am Najua's son. The whites call me Quanah. My mother was white woman, taken as child, chose to stay with the people. She understood, sometimes we must leave everything to find our true home." Over the next hour, as Hobbs and the Reverend watched in amazement, Quanah and his companions helped repair the wheel. They worked with an efficiency that spoke of deep knowledge of the land and its resources. Quanah spoke to Margaret in his careful English, asking her questions no one in Philadelphia had ever thought to ask. "What makes your spirit sing?" he asked as he worked. "Words," Margaret said, surprising herself with the honesty. "Stories. I want to write about people's lives, their real lives, not the sanitized versions we're supposed to pretend are true." "This is good purpose," Quanah said. "Better than being wife to man who does not see you." Margaret's eyes widened. "How did you?" "Your dress, when you arrived," he gestured to her traveling outfit. "New, but your hands, they show you are not used to simple cloth. Your eyes, they show you are running. Only 3 things make a woman run like that: cruelty, love, or cage. You do not have marks of cruelty. You do not have glow of love. So, cage." As the stars emerged above them, Quanah told her about his mother, Cynthia and Parker, taken by Comanches as a child, who had found more freedom and love with the people than she ever could have in the white world. When the Texas Rangers rescued her years later, she had grieved, not for her captivity, but for the life and children she'd been forced to leave behind. "She taught me," Quanah said, "that courage is not staying where you are expected to be. Courage is choosing the life that feeds your soul, even when everyone says you are wrong." When the wheel was repaired and Quanah prepared to leave with his companions, he paused beside Margaret. "You asked earlier what I whispered. I said, want more. This is the question, yes. Do you want more than life that was chosen for you? Do you want to choose your own path?" Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face, not tears of sadness, but of recognition. "Yes. More than anything." "Then take it," Quanah said simply. "In my world, in your world, the cage only has power if you stay inside. You have already walked through door. Now, walk toward something, not just away." He reached into a leather pouch and pulled out a small turquoise stone. "For courage," he said. "To remember, woman who runs from wrong thing is already becoming woman who runs toward right thing." As Quanah and his warriors rode into the darkness, Margaret clutched the stone and felt something fundamental shift inside her. She had been running away from Charles, from Philadelphia, from expectations. But Quanah was right, she needed to run toward something. The stagecoach continued its journey, but Margaret's destination had changed. 6 months after her abandoned wedding, Margaret sat at a wooden desk in a small office in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, writing under the name Me Carter. The desk was scarred and simple, nothing like her mahogany writing table in Philadelphia, but every word she wrote on it felt real in a way her poetry in her father's house never had. She was writing for the Santa Fe Gazette, documenting the real stories of the frontier, not the romanticized tales Easterners preferred, but the truth. She wrote about Mexican families who had lived on this land for generations, about Chinese immigrants building impossible railroads through mountain passes, about former slaves establishing new communities, and yes, about the Comanche and other tribes fighting to preserve their way of life. Her article about meeting Quanah had caused a sensation. She hadn't written it as a captivity narrative or a tale of savage Indians, but as an encounter between 2 people from different worlds who recognized in each other the same hunger for authentic existence. Letters had poured in, some praising her, many condemning her, but all of them reading her words. "Miss Carter." A young Mexican boy appeared at her office door. "There's a lady here to see you. Says she's from Philadelphia." Margaret's heart clenched. Her mother. It had to be her mother, come to drag her back to respectability. But the woman who entered her office wasn't her mother. It was Sarah Whitmore, Charles's sister, whom Margaret had always liked despite their family's connection. "Sarah?" Margaret stood, uncertain. "How did you?" "Your articles," Sarah said, her eyes bright with something Margaret slowly recognized as admiration. "I've been reading them in the papers. Margaret, they're extraordinary. You write about people as if they matter, as if their stories deserve to be told." Sarah sat down uninvited, her proper traveling suit looking out of place in the rough frontier office. "I came because I wanted you to know, you saved my life." Margaret sat down slowly. "What?" "When you ran from that wedding, you know what everyone said. That you were selfish, ungrateful, possibly insane." Sarah's voice shook. "But I kept thinking, she was brave enough to say no. And if she could be that brave." Sarah pulled off her gloves with deliberate care. "I was engaged, Margaret. To Bernard Ashworth. Do you remember him?" Margaret did. Bernard was older, wealthy, and known for his volatile temper. "Sarah, did he?" "He never hit me," Sarah said quickly. "But he controlled everything. What I wore, whom I spoke to, what I thought. Or what I was supposed to think. And everyone said I was so lucky, that he was such a catch. I felt like I was drowning in good fortune." Sarah's eyes met Margaret's. "But then you ran. And I realized, if Margaret Harrison could walk away from Charles Worthington III in front of everyone who mattered, then maybe saying no wasn't the worst thing a woman could do. Maybe saying yes to the wrong life was worse." "What did you do?" Margaret asked softly. "I broke the engagement. My parents nearly disowned me. Society declared me ruined. But then I started volunteering at a hospital, helping with the wounded soldiers returning from the Western campaigns. And I met a doctor there, Thomas. He's kind and he's poor and he actually listens when I talk about wanting to study medicine myself." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and free. "Can you imagine? Sarah Whitmore, wanting to be a doctor." Margaret reached across the desk and squeezed Sarah's hand. "I can imagine it perfectly." "There's more," Sarah said. "I'm not the only one. Your cousin Elizabeth left her husband, he was a drunk who spent her inheritance. Your friend Charlotte from school refused to marry the man her father chose. She's teaching now, at a girls' school in Boston. Margaret, you started something. Women are reading your articles and realizing they have choices." Margaret felt tears prickling her eyes. She had thought her runaway moment was purely personal, a selfish act of self-preservation. But Sarah's words revealed ripples she hadn't imagined, lives changed by her refusal to accept a cage. "I brought you something," Sarah said, pulling a bundle of letters from her bag. "From women who read your articles. They asked me to deliver them personally since I was making the journey." Margaret spent that evening reading the letters by lamplight. They came from all over, a farmer's wife in Ohio who started selling her preserves to earn her own money, a widow in Boston who opened a bookshop, a young woman in Virginia who became a teacher instead of marrying her deceased sister's husband as expected. But one letter stood out, written in careful, educated script. "Dear Miss Carter, I am a Kiowa woman educated at a mission school. I read your article about meeting Quanah Parker, and I wept. You wrote about us as human beings with complex lives and valid choices, not as savages or victims. You understood that my people's fight is not about violence but about the right to exist as ourselves. Thank you for seeing us. Your words build bridges where most build only walls. In hope, little bird who learned to sing." Margaret pressed the letter to her heart. This was what Quanah had meant. Courage wasn't just running away from cages, it was building bridges so others could cross to freedom too. The next morning, Margaret wrote her most personal article yet. She wrote about standing at that altar, about the moment she realized that pleasing others had nearly cost her herself. She wrote about Quanah's question, "Want more?" and how it had become her compass. But mostly, she wrote about how one person's courage to choose authenticity could give others permission to do the same. "We are taught that women's virtue lies in self-sacrifice," she wrote. "But perhaps true virtue lies in being so authentically ourselves that we give others permission to do likewise. Perhaps the bravest thing we can do is stop pretending to be pleased when we are starving, stop smiling when we are dying inside, and start running, not away from responsibility, but toward our own true horizons." 3 years later, Margaret stood on a stage in Santa Fe, publishing her first book, a collection of frontier stories that would eventually change how Americans understood the diverse peoples building the nation. In the audience sat Sarah, now a medical student, and Little Bird, who had become Margaret's translator and co-writer for stories about tribal life. And in the back, though Margaret wouldn't learn this until later, sat a Comanche warrior named Quanah, who had ridden 3 days to see what the runaway bride had built from her courage. As Margaret spoke about the power of choosing authentic lives over expected ones, she touched the turquoise stone she still wore on a chain around her neck. Her husband had never pleased her because she had never been his wife in any meaningful way, she had been a role he expected her to play. But she had pleased herself. And in doing so, she had helped others find their own paths to freedom. What more? Quanah had whispered that night on the prairie. Margaret's life had become her answer, yes. Always yes. And here is how we build a world where everyone can answer yes too. The audience rose in applause, but Margaret was already thinking about her next story, her next bridge, her next step toward a horizon that kept expanding with possibility. She had learned that running from a cage was just the beginning. The real journey was running toward authentic connection, toward purpose, toward a life so true that it lit the way for others. That was the whisper's real promise. Want more? Then become more. Then help others become more too. And in that becoming, everything transformed.